Hello, and welcome to DMing 101 Table Management. My name is Sean Merwin, and I am the seminar coordinator for the Heralds Guild of DMs. We are a volunteer group who are trying to spread the joy of D&D and DMing. We create content for DMs and offer it for free at conventions and game days, and online at the Heralds Guild website. The Heralds Guild is sponsored by Baldman Games. Baldman Games offers convention support to companies like Wizards of the Coast at large events like Gen Con. If you are playing organized play events like the D&D Adventurers League at large conventions, there is a good chance Baldman Games is involved. For this seminar, I would like to introduce Chuck Benscoter. He will talk about the basics of D&D and running a table of players using D&D rules. The content of this seminar was provided by Scott Rain.
Good morning, everyone. How's everyone?
Very good.
I want to start with a quote here for you guys. This is kind of an interesting quote. Some of you may know a guy by the name of Gary Gygax. Anybody know Gary Gygax? Yeah, bring it up. He said something very interesting that I read a long time ago. The secret we should never let the game masters know is that they don't need any rules. That's kind of profound from him. In this seminar, we are going to cover the basics of using rules in Dungeons & Dragons to run a game. As I go through this, keep in mind Gary's quote. I'm going to touch on some things through here. If you've never run a game before or you're just starting out, this is the place for you. We're going to talk about two key skills, narration and adjudication. We're going to discuss some special cases in combat and social interaction, and then we'll have some time for some questions and interaction. I have a quick question. How many are a DM now? Okay. How many have been DMing more than 5 years? How many have less than 5 years? And how many of you have never DM'd at all? Noobs. I love newbies. You guys are the backbone of what we're doing at the Heralds Guild. Thank you for coming. Let's get started. Let's talk about the way the game flows and the two major jobs of the DM. As I said, you have narration and you have adjudication. That is, presenting the game and figuring out what happens when a player takes their actions, specifically through their character. Even if you've been playing D&D for a long time, you might not realize that there is a process to it. It can seem a lot like chaos. The DM talks, the players talk, everybody talks at the same time. They run over each other, dice get rolled, jokes get made, pizza gets eaten, people make unexpected choices. But as the DM, and as you've done this for a while, you begin to realize that there's an underlying order to what's going on. And it's actually really, really simple. The DM presents a situation. The players tell you what their characters are going to do. The DM then adjudicates and determines how that is going to outcome, and then describes it. At that, it becomes a new situation. Wash, rinse, repeat. Okay? As chaotic as a game might seem, that's all that happens. As a DM, it's your job to maintain that back and forth between those two elements, narration and adjudication. The go back and forth volley doesn't really start until you give the players something to respond to. Often an adventure will begin with an opening scene in which you give the characters some sort of a goal, objective, a plot hook, some people call it. After that, you might present another scene that actually gets the adventure started. Eventually, you'll get to the part where you have, as DMs, nothing else to say except those magic 4 words, what do you want to do? When you are presenting a situation to your players, it's important that you do two things. First, you tell the players very clearly what their characters perceive and what they know about that situation. Second, you drive the action. Give them something to respond to. You're the eyes, you're the ears, you're the brains, you're the 5 senses of those characters in the world. If you don't tell the players something, the players don't see it, or the characters don't see it, they don't smell it, they don't know about it, it might as well not exist. More to the point, the players are going to base all of their decisions on what you tell them about the world and the situation. So it's important first to be very clear. Fortunately, most of the adventures you get have box text and descriptions that you go through that guide you on how to tell the players what you need to know. But often, You'll need to fill in some blanks. And because players, they ask those pesky things called questions, and you'll need to respond to that. That's when your job gets harder. They might ask you what else their characters see or hear or know. They might ask you for details that you weren't ready for. And if it's something they might see or hear or know, they deserve an answer. And if the adventure doesn't give an answer, and it might not, you're going to have to make up an answer. If you understand the adventure and the encounter well, you can probably come up with a good answer. Rule number 1, don't be afraid to be wrong. More on that later. In these situations, you might be tempted to use wisdom, perception, or intelligence checks to notice things that they'll recall information, and sometimes that's okay. Don't overdo it. Remember, players are asking questions because they're trying to make a decision. So if there's something they should be able to see or hear or smell or taste, there's a good chance of knowing it, err on the side of just giving them the information. Save the checks for when the characters actually take actions if you can. Of course, sometimes the adventure tells you, roll a perception check, roll your arcana, that's fine. Do that. But don't withhold information if there's no reason to. Don't make rolling your default position. Answer the questions. If you are not just telling the players what they know and perceive when you present a situation, you're also setting up or driving the action. That is to say, something in the situation is going to demand their attention. An ogre screaming bloody murder cries out, literally, for a response. Again, most adventures will give you something to drive action in the initial scene. But after that, you're on your own. Make sure you always acknowledge things the players could do or interact with. And remember, at the end of every action is the beginning of a new action. You need to keep pushing the players to act. Above all, it's vitally important that you are clear and honest. Don't withhold information just because you think it might make the situation more challenging. That's just unfair. Just don't do that. Do not try to dress up your narration with flowery language that doesn't come naturally to you. Players can't make decisions if they can't understand a situation. And if you try and alter your speech or that with words you're not comfortable with, you will confuse the table. They literally can't play the game if they're unclear. And if they feel blindsided by hidden information, they're not going to have fun. Matter of fact, they're probably going to get angry at you real quick. Speak clearly, speak naturally, and always end by saying, what do you want to do? It's a good habit to get into and tells the player that it's their turn to speak. Once a player actually speaks up, a character takes an action. It's your job to work out what happens next. This is adjudication. The rules are there to help you, but you have to determine whether you even need the rules. Remember the quote? The moment the player declares an action, the first thing you have to be sure you understand is what is the character trying to accomplish and how is the character trying to accomplish it. If it is not clear what the characters are trying to do and what they're attempting to do, ask for clarification. It's okay to ask players questions. Once you get a clear statement of intent, like the character is trying to get through the door by picking the lock, or the character is trying to kill the ogre by striking it with his weapon, then you're ready to continue. Once you have your answer, you need to decide a couple of things. Is the action possible? Can it really work? Don't fall into the trap of thinking the answer is in the rules. The rules don't cover everything. If they did, you wouldn't have to sit at the table. You need to decide if there's a chance for the player's action to succeed. Use your common sense and your own best judgment. As long as the action isn't ridiculous, the answer is probably yes. You also need to decide if the action can't actually fail. And this is an important point. Key in on this. Some actions can't fail. Even if they do fail, the character could just keep trying over and over and again until they succeed. I've seen this happen. You're going to break down the door. I will make an attack roll with it with my sword. Why? Make a strength check. If they don't succeed, it took a long time to get the door open. One dice roll, you're done, move on. If they exceed greatly, maybe they got it open really easy. Maybe they're asking for directions in a crowded market. You can ask 22 people. Eventually somebody's going to say, oh yeah, the temple to Ilmatar is over there. They can't possibly fail. So that's an important point. If it's not enough to decide that the action can fail, you also have to decide if the failure means something. For instance, we didn't find the temple to Ilmatar now, but we'll find it later. Sometimes it's enough to give you your answer. If the actions can't possibly succeed, the action fails. If the action can't possibly fail, or if failure doesn't mean anything, it succeeds. It might seem strange for actions to just succeed or fail without using rules or dice, but that's precisely how it's supposed to work. Part of the art of being a DM is knowing when to use the rules and when not to use them. You don't ask someone to roll a dice to walk down a street, right? Now, if the action can succeed, and if it can fail, and if failure means something, D&T provides a very simple mechanic for resolving the action. It's called an ability check. You probably know this already, but you need to determine the outcome of an action. So you ask the player to roll a d20 and add one of their ability modifiers, and if they have a relevant proficiency or a skill or a tool, they can add those. If there's something strong working in their favor, they can roll with advantage. If there's something just as strongly working against them, they might have disadvantage. If a roll equals or exceed some difficulty check, they succeed. Otherwise, they fail. That's it. If you grasp that, you have 95% of the game in your back pocket. You're good to go. Often adventure you're running will define some of the ability checks you need, and you can handle those easily enough. But always be ready to override the rules if an unexpected situation comes up. For example, imagine a player is trying to convince the king to send soldiers to guard the pass, and he plays the king an inspiring war song on his bagpipe, with which he is proficient. The adventure might call for charisma persuasion check to change the king's mind, but a clever DM in that situation might substitute the performance charisma-based skill for check with its appropriate bonus. On the other hand, the player might do something completely unexpected. Remember, part of the fun in D&D is having the freedom to attempt the creative or the unusual or the clever or the just flat-out wacky. Don't squash them just because the adventure writer didn't see them coming. Use the ability check as your tool. First, determine what ability score is relevant. The question is easy to answer if you already know how a character is trying to accomplish the task. Remember, you're supposed to know that. They clearly articulated to you. If the character is being smart and logical, maybe they're using intelligence. If the character is using their might or physical strength, they're going to be using strength. Willpower, intuition, probably wisdom. There are no wrong answers here, so go with what seems best to you. Next, you can determine if there's a relevant proficiency, either a skill or a tool that might come into play along with this. Thieves' tools, for an example. A climbing kit, for example. But also be open to player suggestions. Player might ask, I'm proficient in investigation. Can I add my bonus? Or they might just say, I have the investigation skill. If the proficiency is appropriate, use it. Next, you have to determine the difficulty class. We'll call it a DC. And that's actually really easy. Most tasks are either going to be very easy, medium, or hard. And they're 5, 10, 15, or 20, respectively. Decide which one seems most logical. Is the task the sort of thing an average person could do and expect to do with very little trouble? It's probably very easy. On the other hand, is it the kind of a thing that even a trained person could possibly fail at? And it might be difficult. If you think it's outside of a range, go up or down by 5s. Advantage and disadvantage are powerful tools to modify the chance of success based on exceptional circumstances. They swing the die roll a lot, so don't be too quick to grant advantage or impose disadvantage on every roll. Ask your characters if there's something unusual or special working for or against the character. This includes rewarding very clever thinking on the parts of players. If the player's playing their bagpipes in a war song stirs the king to action, that's not exceptional. If the player references the history of the king's family and reminds the king of his lineage while he's playing the bagpipes and singing, that might be worth advantage. And it's good role-playing. Once you've decided what ability to use, whether a proficiency is appropriate, selected a DC, and decided whether advantage or disadvantage applies, ask the player to roll a die and report you the results. Then you adjudicate. You determine the outcome. Now, saving throws, these are a special kind of a check. They aren't technically ability checks, but they work the same way. When a character suffers some kind of setback they could somehow avoid or resist, you can ask for a saving throw. The process is much the same. Pick an ability, set a difficulty class, decide whether advantage or disadvantage is warranted, ask for a roll. In general, one die roll is enough for any action. Don't fall into the trap of multiples like we gave the example before. The same. It's fun to roll a fistful of die, but rolling 35 fistfuls of dice gets old really fast. This goes for asking for an ability check or then asking for a saving throw to avoid consequences to check fails. In general, that just bogs down the game. Also, the more randomness you add to the game, the worse the players are off. The characters don't... This is resource management. It's kind of in another area, but the more you roll, the worse off they are. Whether you use an ability check to determine the success or failure in action, or whether it is an action that doesn't need a die roll, remember the auto-fail or auto-succeed, it's now your job to communicate the outcome to the player. Remember, the outcome isn't merely success or failure. The outcome is actually what happens as a result of that success or failure. When the player finally persuades the king, the outcome is that the king sends soldiers to defend the pass. When they fail to persuade the king, the outcome is the kingdom adamantly refuses to send soldiers to defend the pass. The PC is climbing the wall, and the outcome they end up at the top, or they move half their speed up the wall, and if they don't succeed, they might fall. If they can't get a grip, they're stuck at the bottom of the wall. Tell the players clearly what is happening, not just you succeeded or you failed. Tell them what is happening. Narrate. How did the world change? Be clear, be open, speak naturally. Remember, telling the players the outcome is also presenting the scene for the next outcome or the next setting. Thus, one action flows through its narration and adjudication to the next, following the same rules for the description you use when you set the initial scene. Notice how simple it is. It just flows. Narrate, adjudicate. If the outcome has any consequences, apply them now. That might include hit points of damage, a condition applied to a creature, lost resources, a change in storyline, resources gained, whatever. Tell the players about those clearly too. That affects their future decisions. Now that you understand the two main jobs of the DM, narration and adjudication, let's discuss some specific combat situations, or some specific game situations, and we're going to start with combat. The most important thing to understand about combat is that the rules of combat exist only to provide structure to the game. Combat is chaotic, and it's complicated, and the rules keep it ordered and manageable. But the combat rules do not change anything else about the game. The game is still a role-playing game. That means you still have to present the situation, the players still declare actions, any possible actions can be resolved by ability checks. Combat just simply provides the rules for certain special actions like attacking or grappling or shoving or disengaging. Key point, remember this, everything that is possible outside of combat is possible inside of combat. As for the rules for initiative and turn order, they are useful in combat for keeping things organized, but they're also inherently limiting. They can sometimes prevent players from working together or acting simultaneously. So, initiative should only be used when absolutely necessary. Don't impose initiative order on scenes outside of combat. If you must take turns to keep things organized, such as during, say, a chase scene, go around the table in order and let people interrupt each other during that turn. Even when combat appears imminent, don't call for initiative rolls until the fight is actually about to break out, and drop initiative as soon as the fight is over. If one side surrenders or tries to flee, drop the initiative order, and resolve things in a more natural way to allow the players the freedom they crave and that we get from our RPG games that we love so much. When it comes to monsters, it's okay to group monsters together in one or more initiative turns. It's much easier to keep track of. But fights are also more dynamic and exciting if the bad guys have several actions spread out throughout the turn. If it's a little too much for you, that's okay, don't worry about it. But if you can keep track of it, try to divide the monsters into several groups instead of just one big lump. And while we're on the subject of taking turns, let's discuss action economy. Action economy refers to how many actions a creature can take during a turn. Remember, every basic creature and character can move up to their speed or speeds and take one action during their turn. They can break up their move with an action in the middle. Every creature can also, for the most part, take a bonus action on their turn. They also get one reaction in between turns. And finally, the creatures can do a number of things that don't really count as actions. You've probably heard I can say a couple of short sentences. It doesn't really count as an action, but it's still a resource. Often a player will take an action that isn't defined in the combat rules. That's okay. But you will have to decide whether it constitutes an action, a move, or no action at all. An action is something that moves the PCs closer to victory or further from defeat or gives them a significant advantage. Something that deals damage, heals a PC, allows a saving throw, ends an effect, maybe disarms a foe, or knocks a foe down would be considered an action. If the PCs adjust their position on the battlefield, it's a move. Otherwise, it doesn't count as an action. As a general rule, don't hand things out as a bonus action. While the game defines some specific actions and spells as bonus actions, they are generally used to create specific class abilities and monster class abilities. Bonus actions are actually incredibly powerful, so be careful with them. If you aren't sure, use your best judgment. Okay, enough about turns. Let's talk about actual actions during combat. Remember that all the rules in the game remain in effect during combat. That is to say, if a player wants to perform an action, they can perform that action, even if it's not on the list of combat actions, as long as the action is possible and it can be done in the span of about 10 seconds or less. They can attempt it. All the freedom of the RPG still exists while in combat. Use the same method to resolve these actions that you use everywhere else. Pick the appropriate ability score, allow the player to add proficiencies and skills as needed or as available, see how the dice fall. If a player comes up with a plan that can decisively end combat, good for them. Let them try it. That counts as a victory. There's nothing that requires a combat to be dragged out for exactly 5 rounds and do exactly so much damage. It's very rewarding for the players to be clever and avoid or diffuse combat. They feel good about themselves and they deserve the victory. And by the way, be careful, do not overuse the attack roll. Dirty little secret is that an attack roll is just an ability check using either strength or dex with a proficiency bonus for a tool. I think we call it a weapon. An attack roll is exactly the same thing as using a set of thieves' picks or opening a lock or making an intelligence arcana check to decipher magical runes. If the player isn't actually using a weapon in the way a weapon is intended to be used, it's probably not an attack roll. If players are breaking down a door, as I used before, for example, it's better to use a strength check. The attack roll is for killing things. When a player does attempt an action in combat or outside of combat, you've got 3 choices for how to resolve it. You can take the action to make an ability check, possibly with a proficiency bonus. You can let the target make a saving throw, or you can have both the actor and the target make opposed ability checks. Now remember, the attack rolls are just an ability check with a proficiency bonus for a weapon. That said, it's important to remember that the rules do not make a distinction between ability checks and attack rolls. Things that modify ability checks do not modify attack rolls, and vice versa. Don't forget that, but in terms of resolving the same things, they function the same way. When an actor's skills or abilities are primarily going to determine the outcome, use an ability check. For example, throwing a heavy cask of oil at someone is primarily a matter of whether the actor can heft and throw the barrel accurately, just like throwing a weapon. When the target's skills and abilities are primarily going to determine the outcome, it's a saving throw. For example, a player cuts a rope to drop a chandelier on someone. The PC doesn't really have any control over the outcome. They just cut the chandelier. In that case, the target of said chandelier is going to try to throw themselves out of the way, or maybe catch it and throw it back if they're big enough. Use a dex throw, maybe a strength saving throw. When the actor and the target can significantly affect the outcome together, use opposed ability checks. For example, Wand of Orcus is skittering across a crevasse as the temple collapses into the abyss. The PC and the Ghoul King both dive for it. In this case, both have to roll dex checks. Maybe with acrobatics, maybe they got athletics. They can power themselves across. Whoever gets the best roll gets it first. In most situations, avoid combining ability checks, including attack rolls and saving throws. Don't use saving throws for opposed rolls. Aside from combat, the other situation that deserves some special attention is social interaction. Like combat, social interaction feels like it is somehow different from the rest of the game, but it's not. It still comes down to players declare an action and DMs resolve the action based on a scene you set up. And you provide the results. It's just that. Instead of declaring and describing actions, the actions are often role-played and acted out. When a player speaks to an NPC, listen closely, ask yourself if what the player is trying to accomplish, how they're trying to accomplish it, and are they trying to get the PC to do something? And are they doing it with charm or deception or intimidation or some other ability? Whatever, if so, they're taking an action. Now ask yourself, is it possible? If it is, ask yourself if the NPC has a reason not to do it. It's important to come from that direction. If the action might succeed or fail, then use an ability check, possibly a proficiency bonus to resolve it. Charisma checks are generally the most common in these situations, but you can substitute other ability scores as you deem appropriate. Be aware, though, that the DM often falls into a trap of using ability check whenever a player asks an NPC anything. It's important not to waste time and dice rolls on unimportant or uninteresting things. When a player asks an NPC for directions to an inn or a temple, for example, there's no reason for the NPC to refuse the help. Don't waste a die roll. Give them the information. Just like it's okay to skip a die roll if there's no chance of failure, it's okay to skip a die roll if there's no chance of success. You wouldn't ask a player to roll a die to see if flapping their arms as they fall off a cliff might let them fly. Don't ask a player to die roll if an action they attempt can't possibly work. Politely asking a city guard to break a law in some terrible way is just not going to work by itself. You need to have some sort of incentive or lever. No matter how persuasive someone is, they can't make someone violate their basic nature by words alone. Part of the game is for players to figure out how to get what they want. And speaking of figuring out the best way of getting what you want, let's discuss advantage and disadvantage. When players are interacting with an NPC, you can use advantage and disadvantage to reflect an NPC's motives, desires, or personality traits to reward the PCs for clever ideas and paying attention. For example, if a PC researches a particular guard and discovers she's highly devoted to her only surviving daughter, a threat against the daughter might be worth advantage when intimidating the guard. If the guard is instead devoted to law, justice, and her duty, offering her a bribe might impose disadvantage because she's very offended by that idea. Now, we've covered a lot of different topics today, but you really only need two of them to run a game. You need to understand the basic flow of the game, narration and adjudication, and you need to understand how to use ability checks. Remember, they are same in combat, they're same in social. Everything else hangs off that. Everything else besides that is a special case. Remember, the basic flow of the game is this. You describe the situation. The players declare their actions. You resolve those actions, and you describe the situation. Wash, rinse, repeat. To resolve an action, determine if an action might succeed or might fail. If it can't succeed, it fails. If it can't fail, it succeeds. It might succeed or fail. Choose an appropriate ability score, determine if it is a proficiency a bonus applies, determine if the creature has advantage or disadvantage, choose an appropriate DC based on the difficulty, and use dice to determine the outcome. Once you have those two skills, narration and adjudication, you're a dungeon master. Congratulations. That's all there is to it. Wait, there's one more secret. The dungeon master is always right. Let me repeat that. Remember this. The dungeon master is always right. I don't mean to give you a huge ego or give you permission to torture players and murder PCs, okay? That's the secret we keep here. We don't actually do that. You know that's not the point of the game. What I mean is your judgment, in the end, is part of the game. D&D includes the DM for a reason. You allow for infinite freedom. You allow for that inherent element to RPGs by being a living, breathing human brain with common sense and good judgment. Don't be afraid to exercise your best judgment. Use it honestly, use it fairly, but use it. The game is not made of porcelain. It's not delicate, and you are not going to be breaking it by calling for a saving throw instead of an attack roll. You won't destroy the game by assigning a wrong ability score or forgetting a rule or making something up on the spot to keep the game moving. The game is not delicate. Whatever you come up with, as long as you do it fairly and consistently, is probably going to be okay. In that sense, you are always right. Even if you make a mistake, you're still right. So don't be afraid to be wrong. Just run your games. Do we have any questions? Come on, newbies.
What are your thoughts on open versus closed rolling? Rolling in front of the players or rolling behind the screen?
Open versus closed rolling. Having your rolls hidden behind the screen where the players can't see them, or rolling out in the open where the players can see them. What is my opinion on that? Well, I use both. In open play, where I play a lot, I generally roll in the open. That keeps it fair for everybody. It's open play. In my home game, I actually roll many of the I want to pick the lock. You didn't pick the lock. You don't know what you rolled. So I play both sides. It becomes a tool for the DM. You can create mystery with hidden roll. People say, "Oh, I'm just..." No. Sometimes you roll in the open. You'll see me, if you go to my tables, you'll see me, I've got a check to save. I'll roll them right out in front. You'll see what the monster rolled. Even in my home games, I do that. In others, I'm behind the screen. So I mix them up. It's a tool, not an obligation. Any other questions? Yes, sir. The monk. So let me rephrase and make sure I got this right. And this is where you clarify. This is actually clarification. I just had my player ask me a question, so I'm going to clarify. You're asking about players who use like a limited set of abilities in a very simple way, and how can you do that? The magic bullet there, I hate to tell you this, is you. Describe a situation which draws them out. You can lay an element of the story or the plot or the hook and draw out of them. Instead of telling them, quit using fire, use something else, lay a different story. Kind of plan ahead of time. If you know characters doing that in doing your DM prep, set something up specifically for their character that has an ability in their sheet that you can pull out of them. It's a neat tool to use. DM prep is one of the most powerful things you can use, and it's not just about collecting minis and getting monster stats and knowing where everything is on the map. It's about knowing your players, too. Other questions? That's a great question. Fantastic question. Okay, fire away. So the question is, theater of the mind, there are people who use exclusively and people who use exclusively just maps and minis. And do you find a happy balance between this? And the answer is absolutely. It's another tool in your arsenal. I hear so many people say, "Oh, I use theater of mind because it's the best way to role play and play this game." "Oh, I use maps and minis because it's the best play." Wrong. wrong, wrong. Again, when you ask your original question before, I said, what is it? It's a tool. You use your prep as a tool. You use theater of the mind as a tool. You would use theater of mind in a chase scene because you're running long distances. You can't keep flopping maps down there. So that's pure theater of the mind. You're measuring distances. But at the same time, you've got a kobold advantage where they want to get pack tactics. You've got to have a map. So mix them up. Don't pigeonhole yourself as a DM into, I only do this. You're cheating yourself with some of the tools and arsenals you have at your ability. Sean.
I'm going to say he's wrong.
I usually am.
What you have to understand, and we could have a whole seminar on theater of the mind versus grid-based combat, but when you play theater of the mind, you're kind of playing a different game than if you're playing grid-based. And the problem a lot of DMs run into is they say, okay, I'm going to try theater of the mind because it's faster, but then they still think in terms of numbers rather than in terms of story. When you switch to fully theater of the mind, you have to get out of the mindset of movement rates and area of effect, and you have to turn it into a story, and your players have to be willing to buy into that. Your players have to be willing to let you use your judgment and them use their judgment. So what you might be doing, what I always do when I'm doing theater of the mind and a fireball goes off, how many can I get? I always throw down that gauntlet of, well, there's your fighters up there. So you could get 5 kobolds, or you could get 8 kobolds and your fighter. Now there's a story. And we're not worried about the map, and we're not. Now it's a discussion between the fighter and the mage about how many hit points do you have. Can I get away with this? You better not do that. And now it's a different game, but it's a fun in a different way for a different set of desires.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a very good question.
That is an excellent question. Other questions? Oh, wow, we're getting good ones. Okay, let's start. I'm going to pick over here for once, then come back. Gentleman in the black shirt.
All right. I have a group of gamers that have been playing.
Repeating the question, how do you handle character party player conflict?
Yes.
Yep. And the question you're asking is, I have different types of players. How do I get them all work together? Seminar 201, which runs tomorrow at 9, is exactly that. Managing player types.
9 in the morning.
9 in the morning. Yep. Same place. And it also runs on Saturday at sometime in the morning. If you look on the schedule, you'll see it. So it runs twice. And the gentleman who put the seminar together went through all the player types, problems you may run into if you have them, and then how you can use them to your advantage when you run your game. So come to that. That's my best suggestion because he breaks it all down.
And that's why this is your 30-second advertisement here. That's why Bald Man Games exists, and we're putting on these seminars to answer these questions. Somebody was over here. Yes, sir. Back there. Yeah, and again, your question is pretty much, again, you're back to player management. You're asking about player management. In this case, teenagers with a singular mindset. I like to refer to it as the video game collect the token mindset, or murder hobos. And we've heard that, where you kick in the door, you kill everything in sight, you steal the treasure, you move to the next room, and there's really no care about if there's a mystery, or you don't care whether the temple's going to destroy the world or not. You're just accumulating gold. Yeah. I would say come to the 201 session about that. That's kind of outside of this scope.
I made a mistake. That's the 202 session.
Oh, 202.
Which is at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and then at 10 a.m. the following on Saturday.
10 a.m. Saturday. So those would be good for that. One other thing, we are recording these, and they're going to be on the Heralds Guild. So, hey, you're all Heralds Guild members. Eventually you'll be able to go on the website and hear my horrible voice again, or the other voices of the much more well-qualified presenters than me. Other questions? Yes, sir. Back here, and then I'll get to you next.
Okay, so I'm a pretty new DM. Thanks for the seminar. Kind of also that before initiative.
Oh, that's an excellent question. What happens if you have players at the table who aren't saying, well, do I know anything about this character? Is that what or this monster?
Yeah,
is that kind of it? Okay. Well, that's kind of up to you at your table. You could roll for them and give them the information. That's going to kind of coach them along. but you may be in the situation where they don't care. So it's kind of a your table call. I can't give you a definitive say do this, don't do that. My question is, are they having fun?
Yeah.
Then you're doing it right. And sir in the green shirt. Oh my. The difference between playing face-to-face and playing online, you've stepped way outside of the purview of what we cover here. But I think theater of the mind plays best there, the kind that Sean is describing. And I'll clarify mine. The kind I'm thinking is when you slip into a short term and do your game and you're moving back and forth, that fluid kind. But I think theater of the mind is going to be your best bet. But to do online play, I've found you really need good tools and people who run in that area.
I want to introduce Dustin.
Hey, Dustin.
Dustin is another member of the Bald Man Game staff. He was doing the recording, but I have a feeling he has something to say about online play.
Yeah, Dustin does a lot of it.
Yeah, I actually run a bi-weekly online game. I actually stream it. If anybody wants to check it out, I'll talk to you after the show about where you can watch. And I think the difference between online play and offline play is going to be largely based on what tools or what method you're using to play online. Here at Gen Con, walking through the hall, I haven't been there yet, but I'm sure you're going to find no shortage of virtual tabletop softwares. Fantasy Grounds, Roll20, D20 Pro, those are the first three that come to the top of my head. Or you might just play on Skype and have one person point a camera. Actually, we've done this. Have one person point a camera, add an actual physical battle map in his home. He'll move the minis for you. He rolls his dice. So what changes you're going to make are going to be based on what options are available through the tool you're going to be using. So my recommendation would be try 2 or 3 different tools. Do a one-shot game in this set. Do a one-shot game in this set. Find what works for you and your group, and then tailor your rules or your customizations around what you're using.
Good question. Great question. And I've got 2 more over here. I'll take the gentleman in the back, and I'll get you at the end. Yes, sir. This is a further question on onlining and about a tool. What was the tool's name again?
Not a tool, just do you guys use face cams?
Oh, face cams. Do you use cams?
I have. So the question is, do we use face cams with our online games? My primary online game is played with people I've known for 20 years. So no, for that particular game, we don't. We have a TeamSpeak setup so we can hear each other, and we primarily play with Fantasy Grounds. I've done another session, however, where before even Roll D20 came out, we were just playing over Google Hangouts. We had a couple dice rollers. 4 of the people were actually all live in the same room. 2 of us were long distance, and so we were using dice rollers and watching the map and everything else. For that, we had cams because it was just built into Google Hangouts. That's going to come back again to what works best for you and your group.
Okay. And in the black shirt.
Sure. So my question is about checks that can't succeed.
Right.
And especially in a situation where players lose track of something that would be obvious to the character.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, they say, I want to jump a chasm. And if the player was proceeding as they want, or do you kind of give them the nudge that that's not a good idea?
The question, and if I paraphrase this wrong, correct me. The question is, do you have a character that forgets one of the narrated setups that you gave and doesn't realize they can't actually leap the 200-foot chasm and they want to try? That kind of a sitting where they forget an element. I err as a side of a DM that something in the game caused them to forget. I give them the information again. There's nothing worse than one of the points I pointed out. Well, I thought it would succeed, and it's like, if you were actually standing there, that's longer than a football field, and you ain't Superman. So, yeah, I would give him the information before, because it's like, yeah, sure, jump, you're dead. Isn't fair. Great question. Any other questions? I had a couple of hands over here that didn't come back up again. Sure. Oh yeah, this is the classic question. This and I will also be not politically correct. Your player comes in playing and they're like 12 years old, and they've got a wizard with an 18 intelligence and a wisdom of 16, and these kids don't have the experience that some of us have, or they just don't have the IQ points to say. Or you're playing somebody, it's easier with strength and dex, but even charisma. That's like, Hitler had huge charisma, and your guy sitting there didn't bathe. So, yeah. How do you do that? Ability checks are your best friend. Sometimes they're just not going to role play that element per se. You're just going to more rely on that. Yes, sir.
You have some advice, and they don't even want to open that module when you try.
Right, absolutely. The intimidation factor. The question is, actually you're touching on, I think, DM prep. And how do you approach prepping in a way? And for new DMs specifically, that point of that getting over that intimidation hump of actually doing this. Wow. Sean, how do you, I'm a just do it kind of a guy, so I'm not the best one to answer this one.
It depends on the adventure that you're running, because you can find some really good adventures that really help a DM move. You know, here's the box text, and it goes right in order. It's kind of like that PowerPoint we just did, laid out in an adventure format. But you really have to convince the DM that they can do it, and then cut it down to basics. All you need to do is present the first thing they see, let the players run from there. If you have players that are like most players, they're going to run with it. And the DM will then just, exactly what the presentation said, figure out if they can do it, do the outcome, then present the next situation. And if an adventure isn't really a straitjacket for the DM, they learn quicker that they can deviate from that adventure more, create their own story, and the players not only will never know, but probably appreciate it more.
Okay. We have time for one more question, and you raise your hand, sir. How do you streamline complicated things? Could be a complicated story element in it, could be a complicated combat. And the easiest way I tell you is how I do project management in my day job. Oh, I said that out loud, didn't I? One bite at a time. You eat an elephant one bite at a time. If it's complicated, just take it apart. Prep it. If you know ahead of time in your prep that it's going to be complicated and it's going to be a problem, that's where you kind of lay your plan out. Again, I told you use prep as a tool, not just to say, okay, here's some paper and minis, but actually what you're going to do. So that might be a really good approach. Sometimes you're going to get into it in the middle of the game where it's like, oh my gosh. Part of it is experience and just getting in and doing it. You just take it as it comes. Remember, you're always right. You will make mistakes, but as the DM, you're that creative, cognitive engine that runs part of this game and really fuels it and drives it. So you really can't be wrong. You just play it and go. That help?
What about from the other side of the screen?
Oh, wow.
That sort of thing.
Well, as long as the party, I would say, is happy with letting them explain it for 30 minutes, and you can run with it, I don't see any reason not to run with it.
If you can break it down into components,
Mm-hmm.
and at each step have a check or have the situation change, just like we were saying. Do you describe the situation? They say, well, I want to do this, and they start their 30-minute diatribe about what they're going to do. Stop them after the first minute and say, okay, how are you going to start this? Well, we're going to go find an elephant. Okay, well, that's the first check. So how do we do that? And then take it one step at a time. Not only does that slow it down and make the story more interesting in the moment, but that gives you as the DM time to get ahead of the player and think, okay, how am I going to tweak the story based on what they are about to do? So slow it down, have some die rolls, get more people involved other than just one player. Make someone else input their abilities into the plan. And now you're not just having one person do something complicated, but you've got everyone working together, talking to each other. And again, then you can sit back and go, oh boy, how am I going to handle this?
And I think that's it. Thank you for coming.
Well, one thing, if you have any questions, if you have any comments about any of the seminars we do, you can email to that address right there. It will come directly to me, and we will create new seminars or tweak existing seminars based on your feedback. And thank you very much.
Thank you.